Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. Today is Friday, September 21st. We're pleased to have you all here at the state's premier civic affairs event. I am John Horvick, President-elect of City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike. For those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, those listening on OPB radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today we will hear a debate about Ballot Measure 80, which, if passed, will allow personal marijuana use and hemp cultivation without a license. It also establishes a commission to regulate commercial sales. But first, some announcements. I'd like to give a warm welcome to City Club's newest members. If there's any here today, please stand. City Club's corporate and media partners are essential to the vitality and sustainability of club activities. I'd like to thank our generous media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. I'd also like to send our deepest appreciation to Friday Forum's corporate sponsors. Please join me in a warm round of applause for our fall sponsors, the AARP, Portland General Electric, and Perkins Coie. We are grateful for your support and your commission to the City Club. If your company or firm would like to support City Club's mission through sponsorship, please contact the friendly staff in the back of the room or call City Club offices. I want to just take a second to let everybody know that City Club has begun its annual fund for this year. Many of you who are members know that City Club started in 1916. We're approaching our centennial. City Club started with a group of folks committed to action, and one of the earlier founders is quoted as saying that no mossbacks or drones were wanted. Well, City Club wants all community members to be part, but we are definitely still committed to action. Today we put together more than 100 events a year, not just Friday Forums, but many programs by New Leaders Council and by AGRA and research. Your membership dues only support 40% of the club's operating revenue, our operating budget. The rest of our expenses are covered through generous gifts by people like you, who intend and enjoy our programs, who participate in our research, who benefit from the great work that City Club does. I encourage you to go online and make a contribution to City Club today. All donations are tax deductible as charitable donations. Today kicks off our first debate of the election season. Join us next week for a conversation with guests from Syria, Congo, and India about how women in some of the world's most challenging places are using new media technology to make international headlines. Our first candidate debate will be the following week, October 5th. The mayoral debate between Charlie Hales and Jefferson Smith. Tickets are on sale now. You can learn more about these events at our website, pdxcityclub.org. And now to our program. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Stephan. She serves as lead strategist on many health and well-being, education, and human service initiatives in her role as managing director and senior vice president of Pyramid Communications. She specializes in guiding organizations through strategic planning to help define and maximize their impact. In addition to setting strategy, Sarah leads firm-wide business development across Pyramid's 5 core practice areas, regionally and nationally, including health and well-being, education, energy, environment, native and tribal communities, and arts and culture. Sarah holds a bachelor's degree in English from Carleton College, where former political science professor Paul Wellstone served as her advisor prior to his election to the U.S. Senate. And without further ado, please help me welcome Sarah.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Stephan, and it is my privilege to moderate this debate on Ballot Measure 80 between Paul Stanford, who supports the measure, and Joshua Marquis, who opposes the measure. Ballot Measure 80 is a citizen initiative which, if passed, will allow personal marijuana and hemp cultivation use in Oregon without a license. It also establishes a commission to regulate commercial sales. This debate will have several sections. First, each debater will give a 3-minute opening statement in the order previously determined by a coin toss. Mr. Marquis will open today's debate. Following the opening statements, debaters will respond to questions written in advance of this meeting by City Club's Friday Forum Committee and City Club staff. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. Sorry, guys. We will rely on the judgment of our distinguished panel of City Club members seated at the table in front of me to decide whether or not the debaters have indeed answered each question. If 2 or more of these members raise their question mark cards, indicating that they feel the moderator's question has not been answered, my question, I will restate the question and the debaters to reply again. Ask them to reply again. The debaters will lose 30 seconds from the time normally allotted for their response and will only have 30 seconds to reply. If the debater still fails to answer the question, the panel can indicate this by holding up their cards, but the debaters will not get a third opportunity to respond. On our panel, we have Ted Kay, Wynn Wakala, and Jonathan Rodmacher. Keeping time at our debate today is Tony Yacarino. Following the City Club's questions, each debater will have the opportunity to ask either 1 or 2 questions of the other, time permitting. After this rotation of questions, the debaters will make their 3-minute closing statement. Mr. Stanford will close the debate. Please be respectful of the debaters, and please hold all of your applause until the end of the program. And now, our debaters. Josh Marquis has been the District Attorney of Clatsop County, that's Astoria, since 1994. He is former president of the Oregon District Attorneys Association, has served on the board of directors of the National District Attorney Association since 1997, and on the ABA's Criminal Justice Section Leadership Council since 2009. Josh is a frequent guest on national radio and television programs discussing the criminal justice system and the nature of the relationship between popular culture, the media, and the law. Paul Stanford is an entrepreneur with expertise in hemp and cannabis. He has arranged financing and bank letters of credit for import-export of cargo container shipments of hemp products to and from Asia, Europe, and North America. Also, he has been an expert court witness on marijuana and medicinal cannabis. Paul is the author of many articles published in both magazines and books. And now, if I could invite the debaters, please, up here to their podiums. I was told to wait. Mr. Marquis, your opening statement.
I'm having a little hard time hearing you.
Sorry, your opening statement,
Thank
please.
You. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the City Club. My name is Josh Marquis. I'm the District Attorney in Clatsop County, Oregon, and I'm here speaking both on my own behalf and that of the Oregon District Attorneys Association, 36 independently elected DAs from across Oregon who frankly rarely can agree on any one issue, but we do agree on this one. And although this is somewhat awkward because I'm not the proponent, Paul and I have debated a couple other times, and since I have now 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'd like to address the main issues. This is essentially a solution in search of a problem. We do not live in Georgia or Texas. Let's talk about very practically what happens in Oregon if you're caught with marijuana. almost 40 years ago, a DA in Eugene, Oregon, named Pat Horton, sponsored decriminalization of less than an ounce of marijuana. So for 40 years in Oregon, a person caught with what used to be called a lid, and anybody probably under the age of 40 doesn't know what I'm talking about, but a lid used to be an ounce, and it sold for about $10 to $15 when I was at the University of Oregon in the 1970s. It was probably about 2% tetrahydrocannabinol. The marijuana today, Paul could probably tell you much better, but depending on where you buy it, anywhere between $200 and $800 an ounce, and it's much better dope. The THC content's about 25%. The point being that you do not go to jail, you do not have an arrest record, period. So, but let's assume it's more than an ounce. What happens in Oregon? Well, the only way that you can be prosecuted for a felony would be if you had theoretically more than an ounce. I'm in court every single day in my county, which is a mid-sized county, and I have never, in my recollection, arraigned somebody who was in custody. I asked the Department of Corrections and found out of the 15,000 people in prison, how many are there on possession of drug charges of any kind? The answer was, out of 15,000, 34. How many were there on just marijuana charges, possession? The answer was 6. And all of them, by the way, had very extensive other records. The claim is that this will tax an existing industry. What Mr. Stanford is asking for basically is a grudge match, which the U.S. Justice Department, the Obama administration, just in the last couple days has raided marijuana plantations both in Southern Oregon and in Northern California. They've made it clear they will not tolerate it. So the fact of the matter is that the idea that people who are growing marijuana is a weed, unlike tobacco, OxyContin, all these other drugs, it's very easy to grow. You can grow it in your basement, in your attic, anywhere. So why on earth would someone who is making money either as a hobby grower or a full-on entrepreneur all of a sudden say, well, I'll let the government take 20%. And oh, by the way, I'm going to put my name on a list so when the federal government comes after me, they can arrest me and charge me with a felony.
Mr. Stanford, your opening statement, please.
Good afternoon, Civic Club members and civic leaders and guests. I'm proud to be here this afternoon to address you regarding Measure 80, which is an historic opportunity for the state of Oregon to bring what I see as sensible thinking to the question of marijuana. First of all, I'd like to put this in a historical context and look at the vote that ended alcohol prohibition. In 1932, Oregon voted on ballot measure 7, which passed with 57%, and they understood that regardless of whether they consumed alcohol or not, or supported the alcohol industry, that prohibition wasn't really getting anywhere, and it was the worst way to deal with this problem. So they changed their minds and regulated marijuana. Now that was 1932. Federal alcohol prohibition, the Volstead Act, wasn't repealed till 1933. Oregon led the way then, and we can lead the way now. Many in the status quo in Oregon back in 1932 said that we couldn't lead the way to do this. But we did, and the rest of the nation did follow. We go forward to today, and Oregon's wine industry is a nearly $3 billion industry, employing more than 10,000 people with jobs in agriculture, food processing, marketing, finance, and retail services. Oregon's beer industry, with brew pubs and distillers also, that's the $2 billion a year industry, employing thousands and bringing money into our state. What Measure 80 says simply is that marijuana prohibition has failed in Oregon and across the nation. We have an opportunity here to fix a long-standing failure, regulate a market that isn't going anywhere, that will remain here whichever way this vote goes. And when we can create tax-paying jobs, new tax revenue, and have Oregon create a sensible policy for our state. Measure 80 will regulate marijuana like liquor for adults 21 and older, with sales only through state licensed stores. There will be DUI penalties for people who are driving under the influence. Those do not change. Not only that, but Measure 80 includes rules for against people consuming marijuana in public, just like there are laws in place for consuming alcohol in public. It will save tens of millions of dollars in public safety costs. It's a sensible policy. It means our cities and counties will have more money for their budgets, be able to focus on truly dangerous substances. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. Well, the war on marijuana is insanity, and Measure 80 is the solution.
So we will now move to the portion of the program where I will ask the questions prepared by the Friday Forum Committee. The debaters, both of you, have not seen these questions in advance. There will be two kinds of questions during this debate. I will direct some questions to one debater. He will have 60 seconds to respond. His opponent will then have 45 seconds to rebut. I will also direct the questions to both debaters, each of whom will have 60 seconds to respond. We encourage our debaters to use their time not only to offer their response, but also to rebut their opponent's statement. We will begin with a question to both Mr. Marquis and Mr. Stanford. Mr. Stanford will answer first. In 1973, the Oregon legislature made Oregon the first state to decriminalize marijuana by allowing possession of small amounts without criminal penalties. Mr. Stanford, why isn't decriminalization enough? Mr. Marquis, we got rid of alcohol prohibition in the 1930s. Why treat marijuana differently? Mr. Stanford, your response.
Keeping marijuana as a controlled substance and prohibiting its possession continues to lead to adults being arrested and not recognizing that cannabis is a drug that isn't as bad or deleterious as alcohol. So our initiative will regulate it and establish sensible policies controlling its use, keeping it out of the hands of kids. Today, actually, children have easier access to marijuana than adults do. In fact, over 80% of kids in high school say that it's easier for them to get marijuana than it is for them to get alcohol. So I believe we need to regulate this, and that's what Measure 80 will do.
Well, for one thing, you can't be arrested for possessing less than an ounce of marijuana. A police officer cannot arrest you. It's not a crime. It's like a speeding ticket. They could write you out a citation. They cannot detain you. So that's simply not true. Not only do we have the 1973, we also have in 1998 Oregonians who are compassionate passed the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act. And we're told that between 500 and 1,000 people would benefit from it. I have no doubt that, and Paul said it, marijuana is a drug that, as he calls it, is relatively non-addictive. So let's take it. And that's the difference, to answer your question about what's the difference between that and the Volstead Act. You know, talking about what happened 80 years ago with what was a failed attempt to just flat out all of a sudden say all alcohol is illegal, it was a disaster across the board. Everybody violated the law, and it encouraged organized crime. What we're talking about with this proposal is already marijuana is available for less than an ounce. It's available for Oregon medical marijuana, and so there simply is no problem that needs to be solved.
Now I will direct a question to one debater who will get 60 seconds. The second debater will have 45 seconds to rebut. My question is to you, Mr. Marquis. The federal government classifies every drug sold in the U.S. from Schedule 1, the highest, to Schedule 5, the lowest, based on a drug's medical risk or how addictive it is. Marijuana has a federal Schedule 1 substance classification. While 17 states and the District of Columbia have legalized medical marijuana, the federal government retains the power to prosecute those who use Schedule 1 drugs. If Oregon voters pass Measure 80, how do you see this conflict playing out here?
The there is no doubt in my mind, and I wrote an op-ed 8 years ago in the Oregonian, that marijuana ought to be reclassified as a Schedule II drug. Schedule I drugs, very briefly, are drugs with no medical use. No doctor can prescribe them. Schedule II are things like OxyContin, cocaine, things that can be prescribed. Marijuana should be one of those. But to answer your question directly, what will happen, there's something called the Federal Supremacy Clause. And if let's just say, for example, in England, heroin is used as a legitimate hospice drug, and it has real value. If Oregon decided, let's say, as part of our palliative care, that we were going to make heroin available under those circumstances, we would be in direct conflict. The federal DEA would win. And the Obama administration, to say nothing of what an Romney administration would say, has said, we are not going to permit this, and they've made it clear again by the arrests that they're making that this is a violation of federal law, and states can pass all the laws they want. They won't go along with it.
Mr. Stanford, your rebuttal and response.
The fact that marijuana is stronger, according to Mr. Marquis and studies, means that a lot of people use significantly less of it. When it comes to the federal supremacy issue, we designed this bill to be upheld in federal court by establishing findings by the sovereign, we the people. And so we anticipated a federal court challenge and designed this law to be upheld in federal court. So there are studies at the University of Michigan since the 70s, a study called Monitoring the Future, where they survey high school students. They've shown there's been a long-term decline since the 1980s in the use of alcohol and tobacco. In fact, just this past couple of years, the use of marijuana has exceeded that of tobacco.
My next question to Mr. Stanford first. According to a 2011 study funded by the National Institutes of Health, 1 out of every 15 high school students smokes marijuana on a near daily basis, thinking it carries very little risk of harm. If voters approve ballot measure 80, what protections would be put in place to help reduce teenage marijuana use? Mr. Stanford.
Yeah, we establish strict regulation and strict penalties for people providing marijuana to minors. It'd be a felony to sell marijuana to a minor under measure 80. It would be a misdemeanor to provide it without charge. It would also keep in place the driving under the influence laws, and it would fund development of new testing through the taxes and the license fees. It would fund new studies into making certain that drivers on the road aren't impaired. When alcohol was legalized, there weren't breathalyzer tests, and they're using tests currently in Europe where they can detect marijuana with mouth swabs. So we have strict penalties in place for selling it out of the state as well.
Well, just all we have to do is look at Oregon's in the alcohol business, for better or for worse, and look what a great job we've done at keeping alcohol out of the hands of kids. We have an epidemic in my community, I know, and one of the problems is that any substance that can be abused, and alcohol and marijuana are both substances that can be used and they can be abused, is subject to being abused. And if you throw open the doors and say, okay, we are going to allow another drug of abuse, something that can do harm, maybe in some cases do good, you're going to have kids that are going to use it. And frankly, at the moment, it is a Class A felony with a presumptive prison sentence to furnish controlled substances like marijuana to a minor. We don't prosecute them very often, but I don't expect anything in this bill to change that.
My next question, addressed to Mr. Marquis. If marijuana were to become legal in Oregon, we may see Oregonians driving under its influence. With no accurate marijuana impairment test currently available for law enforcement, how will we protect the public from impaired drivers? How would you address concerns about increased danger from commercial vehicle operators, like airline pilots and bus drivers, operating vehicles under the influence of marijuana?
That is an excellent question, and marijuana is radically different from other drugs in that it's fat soluble. And what that means is, if somebody is consuming alcohol, we have an easy test that we can give them Either they blow into a machine or we take a blood sample. We can tell exactly what your blood alcohol level was when you left this room, assuming you were consuming alcohol at lunch. We can tell pretty well, same thing with OxyContin, Xanax, any other number of drugs. But because marijuana is fat soluble, all we can tell, and I've tried these cases, I've tried DUIs with marijuana, and the answer is, well, all I can tell you is this person's positive for marijuana. That means they might have smoked marijuana 2 hours ago, or they might have smoked it 2 days ago, or they might have smoked it 2 weeks ago. And so, no, there is no current technology that enables us, unlike all the other drugs of abuse, legal and otherwise, to be able to determine that. And I just would end by saying, if you're coming back from a ski vacation from Mount Hood, how would you feel knowing that the person driving the other way has just consumed a bunch of their newly legalized marijuana on the road?
Your rebuttal and response.
Yes. Driving is a privilege, it's not a right, and it's a privilege that can be revoked. Do we really think that Oregonians are waiting for marijuana to be legal so we can use it while driving? I ask you, do you think you would be using it while driving if it was legal? I don't think that people are waiting for that to go into place. You know, Measure 80 leaves the tough penalties for driving under the influence in place. There are already tests in Europe. They use mouth swabs to detect cannabis recent use, and our initiative will fund new development of new technology and new tests so that law enforcement can enforce driving under the influence and safety on our roads.
My next question to Mr. Stanford. The state of Washington just got rid of state-run stores for the sale of hard alcohol. And many Oregonians are talking about getting rid of state-run liquor stores regulated by the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. Measure 80 proposes setting up a system of marijuana retail outlets regulated by a similar commission. Why set up a regulatory system for the sale of marijuana modeled on a system that many consider out of date?
You know, the state of Washington is also voting on a marijuana legalization bill, or that would regulate it. It's I-502. The state of Colorado is voting this year as well on a similar bill, Amendment 64. So we designed this, again, to be upheld in court, and part of that is having a central state commission take control of the market. So rather than having it meld with Oregon's Liquor Control Commission, which a lot of Oregonians have questions about the way it's run, we decided to create a new commission. So the governor will appoint the commission for the first year, and those commissioners will implement new administrative rules and regulations to control the market.
Mr. Marquis.
Well, I urge you to read the Cannabis Act. One of the things that's disturbing about it is just frankly that the almost religious zeal it seems to have for cannabis and hemp. I mean, it will cure your impotence, your lumbago. It will get you up for breakfast. It will solve world peace. I mean, really, just about everything else is in the first couple pages. But to the point, I would suggest you look at Section 2, where it talks about a state commission being created. A governor would appoint 7 people, 5 of the commissioners to be elected at large by growers and processors. Never heard of such. I mean, you have a marijuana commission run, and the response is, oh, it's just like the Blueberry Commission. I'm sorry, marijuanas are not blueberries and filberts.
My next question to Mr. Marquis. The NAACP Alaska, Oregon, Washington State Area Conference endorsed Ballot Measure 80, noting that African Americans have been arrested for marijuana use at higher rates than white adults. How would the passage of Measure 80 affect communities of color in Oregon?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part? I had a hard time hearing you.
How would the passage of Measure 80 affect communities of color in Oregon?
It would not affect communities of color in Oregon. With all due respect, if you look out in this audience, looks like an overwhelmingly white audience, and maybe part of that is the City Club. Also, this is the subject. Marijuana is an interest, frankly, less of interest to the communities of color than it is sort of middle-class white people. The key issue there is arrest. There are many parts in this country where police can use as a pretext the mere possession of a small amount of marijuana, and that's the concern of the NAACP, that officers are using it as a pretext to arrest young black males and other people of color. In Oregon, you can't do that because, as we've talked about earlier, possession of less than an ounce is not a crime, and an officer cannot use that to detain someone or further search them.
Mr. Stanford, your rebuttal and response.
Here in Oregon, African Americans make up 2% of the population, yet they're 9% of our prison population. Often, when people are violated for probation and parole infractions, it's because they have tested positive for or in possession of marijuana. The NAACP endorsed Measure 80 because they see the harm that drug prohibition causes their community. So our initiative will restore sanity to this debate and in marijuana prohibition.
We will now return to allowing each debater to have 60 seconds to answer. My question to Mr. Marquis. A 2009 report by the California police chiefs found that medical marijuana dispensary operators have been assaulted, minors have been sold marijuana, and there is loitering, increased traffic and noise, and robberies of customers just outside dispensaries. A different 2012 study from UCLA found no correlation between the presence of marijuana retailers and an increase in crime. Mr. Marquis, if Measure 80 passes, how can the marijuana retail system develop in ways that support public safety? Mr. Stanford, what is the likelihood that neighborhoods in Oregon with retail marijuana outlets will face an increase in crime? Mr. Marquis?
Well, my opposition to Measure 80 is not that if you have a marijuana dispensary that you're all of a sudden going to get a bunch of junkies hanging around who are going to boost your car and hijack you. I don't think that's the problem. The problem, again, is blowing the doors off access to marijuana, which is already pretty much available in Oregon. It's sort of a red herring argument. I'm not claiming that dispensaries. By the way, Oregonians rejected dispensaries 2 years ago, pretty overwhelmingly. I think Paul was involved in that as well. So my concern is not that that if this passes, the dispensaries that are going to exist are going to create crime. It's that the other issue is that marijuana is already pretty much available. There's very little downside to possessing it. And why on earth would we want to get involved in a giant grudge match with the U.S. Department of Justice? Paul can say, well, we wrote it to be upheld. Everybody writes these measures to be upheld. We're going to be going up against the Justice Department.
Mr. Stanford, your response.
According to Jeffrey Myron, an economist at Harvard, we'll see savings in the criminal justice system, everything from arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating marijuana growers and dealers and probation and parole violees of over $60 million a year. Those resources can be reallocated to enforcing crimes such as robbery to make our neighborhoods safer. I'd just like you to think for a moment, if you had someone breaking into your home, how would you feel to know that the police are tied up with a marijuana arrest and can't come and enforce that law? In fact, that happened in Oakland, California, when they raided several dispensaries in California. At the same time that raid was going on, a crazy person went to a local college and shot and killed 7 people. Right when that call went out, the police were surrounding a vehicle to haul away the marijuana from the dispensary.
Mr. Marquis.
Let me make sure I understand what that.
Sorry. Right. Sorry about that. Mr. Stanford, what is the likelihood that neighborhoods in Oregon with retail marijuana outlets will face an increase in crime?
I think that crime rates will go down because the law enforcement will be able to concentrate their resources on people who are robbing places and not on marijuana growers and dealers.
All right. My next question begins with you, Mr. Stanford. Proponents claim Oregon gets $140 million in new tax revenues and saves $60 million in law enforcement costs if Measure 80 passes. Mr. Stanford, how do you support those claims? Mr. Marquis, what's the economic impact of Oregon's law enforcement, judicial, and correction systems if Measure 80 passes? Mr. Stanford.
We took those figures again from Jeffrey Myron, an economist at Harvard University, has a website, prohibitioncosts.org, and he estimated the savings across the United States and said that we'd see a savings of over $60 million a year. And so we're using those figures.
This came up at a debate. I'm sorry, you done?
I'm done.
Okay. We had a discussion with the East Oregonian Publishing Company yesterday, and he used those same numbers. And I said, where did they come from? And he got sort of the answer, and he said, in Clatsop County, it was $1 million. My budget is $1.2 million. Here, Paul, here's $10. This is the amount of money that I believe that is spent on my salary that covers marijuana in 1 year. To answer your question directly, DAs, there was a letter to the editor in one of the Portland papers saying district attorneys and sheriffs will lose their jobs if they don't have it. We don't make money off prosecuting marijuana cases. The money goes into the state general fund. It's a relatively low level of enforcement. We frankly have better things to do. Cops if they're out rousting drug people, they're out rousting people for methamphetamine, which is a much greater risk to our community.
All right, my next question will begin with Mr. Marquis. A Willamette Week article published in August calls the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act, quote, by far the most expansive and least restrictive of the legalization measures currently before voters, end quote, in Colorado, Washington, and Oregon. For example, in Oregon's measure, there is no limit on personal possession of marijuana, while there is a limit proposed in Washington and Colorado. Mr. Marquis, what challenges does this pose? Mr. Stanford, why is the ballot measure written this way?
Well, it is a huge problem because, again, first off, you can possess up to an ounce, which, if memory serves from my college days, is about 15 or 20 joints, which ought to keep you happy for a relatively long period of time. If you have a medical marijuana card, you can possess 1.5 pounds at any given time, which is a whopping amount of marijuana. So the idea that specifically the challenge it presents is if there's no limit, what is somebody doing with 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 pounds of marijuana? The answer is they're reselling it. And they're probably not doing it through a dispensary plan. They're probably selling it the way illegal and illicit drugs are sold now, or alcohol is sold to kids who, cluster around the local stop and rob trying to get people to buy booze for them.
Mr. Marquis. Sorry, Mr. Stanford.
That's all right.
I was reading ahead.
I've helped a lot of different medical patients cultivate marijuana, and some of them grow small plants, some of them grow larger plants. So we didn't impose a limit on it because we didn't know exactly what that limit should be. So.
All right. My next question will begin with Mr. Stanford. Is there any middle ground that proponents and opponents would support between outright legalization as proposed by Measure 80 and the current state law? Mr. Stanford.
I believe there's a middle ground. The allowing adults to possess and buy cannabis would be a good first step to raise revenue. That's certainly open for debate. The legislature so far, even in the terms of medical marijuana, has failed to impose a licensing system on the medical marijuana market. So I believe there's certainly a lot of middle ground and room for debate. Our initiative would allow the legislature to revise that. They could look at this and change the law as they see fit. We'll be open to debate. and we welcome that.
Well, let me be as direct as I can. I think the middle ground is the only way to resolve this and not bring the federal government down on us is the reclassification of marijuana as a Schedule II drug by the federal government. That's already been done, by the way, by the State Pharmacy Board, but it's meaningless. So if all of the parties got together and convinced our federal legislative delegation, which probably would not be thrilled to be asked to do this, but to get together with other legislators and say, look, it's crazy to be saying marijuana is as dangerous as heroin and LSD and ecstasy. Let's reschedule it. But, you know, Paul keeps talking about all the money we're going to make. I don't think the first thing we ought to be thinking about in public safety and health is how much money can we make off of this. I think the question ought to be, you know, if this is a drug that can be abused, how can we limit it to those people who need it and not have it basically run wild in the community?
Now I will once again direct a question to one debater who will get 60 seconds. The second debater will have 45 seconds to rebut. My first question to Mr. Marquis. According to an article in the Atlantic Monthly, there may be more people in prison today for violating marijuana laws than at any other time in the nation's history. Calculations based on data provided by the Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Sentencing Commission suggest that 1 of every 6 inmates in the federal prison system, that's roughly 15,000 people, have been incarcerated primarily for a marijuana offense. In light of the significant budget shortfalls at the federal and state levels, should these statistics be viewed as a sign of success or an indictment of the war on drugs?
We're not here to debate the war on drugs. We're here to debate Measure 80, which will not affect federal law but state law. Keep in mind that the federal prisons have about 190,000 people in custody. State prisons have approximately 1.2 million. So federal laws are draconian for marijuana. The number, like I said, I did my math. There are, even if you extend it maximum, 10 people in prison in Oregon out of 15,000 for marijuana possession of greater than an ounce. And all of them have extensive records, and almost every one of them was a plea down from manufacturing. So we're talking about Oregon and changing Oregon's law. We don't have the ability to change the federal law. We could try to do it. But in Oregon, we are not locking up 1 out of every 6, 1 out of every 60, or even 1 out of every 6,000 Oregonians over marijuana.
Mr. Stanford, your response.
If all 3 of the states that have marijuana laws pass these, or even one of them do, it'll send a strong message to the federal government that the states and the people are tired of the consequences of prohibition. Our initiative, we believe, just as the Death with Dignity law was enjoined when it passed in 1994, will be enjoined by the federal government. In that law, the case was fast-tracked, and 2 years later it was upheld in Gonzalez versus Oregon. I believe the same thing will happen with Measure 80 when it passes. It'll be enjoined by the federal government, the Supreme Court will review it, and that'll change the drug scheduling and take marijuana out of the Schedule I status it currently has at the Supreme Court's direction.
My next question to Mr. Stanford. The Oregon legislature already supports agriculture hemp. So why include hemp in a measure that seems focused on marijuana cultivation, use, and sale? Mr. Stanford.
The artificial economic barriers imposed by marijuana prohibition have prohibited hemp for fuel, oil, fiber, and food. There's no state in this country, and 7 or 8 states have passed hemp laws that's allowed to cultivate hemp for fuel, fiber, and food. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that the majority of it is imported from Canada. Oregon could lead the way in providing hemp for fuel, hemp for food, and hemp for fiber. We could reopen our closed pulp mills, our closed fiberboard mills and use hemp as a resource. I really believe that hemp is going to be the main economic engine compared to the drug market. I think it will dwarf the drug market, and that's one of the primary motivations I have for putting Measure 80 on the ballot.
Mr. Marquis.
Well, this gets back to this idea that sort of, marijuana and hemp are the answer to all of our problems. If this measure were just about making, so people understand, essentially hemp is sort of male marijuana, and then the flowering portion, which is female, produces the buds which contain THC. There's very, very tiny quantities of THC in ordinary hemp, and you would be smoking banana peels before you'd get probably higher sooner than hemp. If this was about hemp, we wouldn't be having a debate. We wouldn't really care. And it's true that there are some barriers to it. But to get back to the question, what this is this is an artifice. This isn't about agriculture. This is about legalizing a drug. And by the way, 12 years ago, 14 years ago, all these supporters said, this is a drug, we need to get it to the people who need it. And now they say, oh no, never mind that discussion. We don't want to have that one anymore.
This question is the last question for both of our debaters, and it will be addressed to Mr. Marquis. Physicians have expressed the need for better research on the drug to provide more informed patient counsel. Meanwhile, a group of governors is urging the federal government to reclassify marijuana so that the drug is more widely accepted for medical treatment. Is the limited scientific evidence on the possible benefits and detriments of cannabis a barrier in setting public policy and helping voters to make an informed choice? Mr. Marquis.
Well, Paul and I might actually agree on this. They probably are. By putting it in Schedule 1, it basically makes it virtually impossible, except with very special permission, to do any kind of research. So I think there are legitimate medical uses for marijuana, not nearly as many as probably Mr. Stanford thinks. And keep in mind, this is not about medical marijuana. But to answer your question, yes, I think it probably is an impediment. And again, if the federal government, and it would not, by the way, be the U.S. Supreme Court that would do it, the case he's talking about, Gonzalez versus Oregon, dealt with the then Attorney General trying to go after doctors in this state that were prescribing pentobarbital for people who wanted to end their lives. Pentobarbital is a Schedule II drug, and basically what the Supreme Court said, you can't get between the doctor and the patient. The problem is marijuana is currently a Schedule I drug, and that's the issue that has to be addressed.
Mr. Stanford.
We believe that Measure 80 will regulate the market and take it out of the hands of the kids and substance abusers who control it today. Currently, kids have easier access to marijuana than adults do. So our initiative is specifically designed to lower the use of marijuana by teens. And we believe we establish firm policies to start it. Could I ask you to restate that question?
Oh, sorry, let me work my way back here.
Sorry.
Is the limited scientific evidence on the possible benefits and detriments of cannabis a barrier in setting public policy and helping voters to make an informed choice?
Marijuana has been studied probably more than any other substance known to man. It is continually reviewed, and there's a lot of evidence to show that it is fairly innocuous. So, hope that answers that.
We will now move to the final portion of the program, 3-minute closing statements from each debater. We will begin with Mr. Marquis.
Thank you. I don't think I'll need 3 minutes. I think what you've heard is a lot of arguments about why if the federal government would do this, if Oregon would just take the lead, then the scales will fall from their eyes at the Supreme Court, and the federal government will do the right thing. again, we haven't talked, the fact of the matter is that you're not going to jail in Oregon for possession of marijuana. The police cannot arrest you for possession of small amounts. If you get caught with felony possession of marijuana, your odds are about as, only slightly worse than winning the lottery, that you might actually go to prison. And if you get a medical marijuana card, that's probably easier than getting a driver's license. You can possess 1.5 pounds of marijuana. So, where's the problem? There just is no problem there. The alternative to that, which they're suggesting, is let's not do it incrementally anymore. Let's make it a cash crop available to anybody. And one of the questions that I'd like us to know is, how much money does Mr. Stanford make off of the marijuana trade? He's an entrepreneur, and I'm assuming he will become a much wealthier entrepreneur if this passes. As a prosecutor, I have all the customers I want. I'm not looking to put more people in prison. There's always somebody else out there committing a much worse act than possession or even delivery of marijuana that's begging for my time, and all the other prosecutors. But what we've seen the devastation alcohol does in our communities. I think anybody in law enforcement knows that 75 to 80% of all crime is in some way related to substance abuse. That doesn't mean they're being arrested for substance abuse, but substance abuse plays a part in it. Just like you can have drink responsibly and people can enjoy a couple glasses of wine, people I'm sure probably can smoke a doobie and sit in their house and listen to music and enjoy it, but then there are other people that will abuse it. And they'll also give it to their 14-year-old friends. If you take away all the barriers, the few barriers that continue to exist in this state against marijuana, you're going to see an explosion of marijuana even greater. And for all the reasons that we're asking questions in terms of our inability to control it when people driving, and the fact that we just look at our record with alcohol and our ability to keep that a regulated drug out of the hands of kids. We've done a terrible job. And then I just urge everybody to actually read the Cannabis Act. Now Paul has said, oh, don't worry, we'll go back to the legislature. No, you're voting on this act. You're not voting on basically, 7 come 11, the legislature will come in and fix it. You're voting on this. This is a bad idea, and we urge you to vote against it.
Mr. Stanford, your closing statement.
Over the past 20 years, we've seen a reduction in the use of tobacco and alcohol, and they're at record lows. And now we're seeing an increase in marijuana use, and it's at a record high. The number one reason that we were given for criminalizing marijuana is public safety. But the failed war on marijuana is not about public safety. It's after trillions of dollars wasted and countless lives ruined, we have to stand up and say what we're doing has failed and we need a new approach. What we're talking about is reforming laws, and one of the messages we get is, what message are we sending kids? I ask you, what message are we sending kids when we're cutting education spending, forcing more parents and students to go into debt for school, while continuing to lock up more and more people? The prison incarceration rate is at a record high. The United States has more people in prison than any other country in the history of the world. A lot of those people are there for nonviolent crimes, and it's driven by the war on marijuana. It's easier for kids to get marijuana than it is liquor, and that's why we regulate liquor. We educate people about liquor. Alcohol use is at a historic low, but 8 out of 10 kids say they can get marijuana more easily than alcohol. Street dealers don't ask for ID. Oregonians have a history of tackling tough issues in our own way. We passed the bottle bill, beach access bill, death with dignity, mass transit, the Oregon Health Plan. We have an opportunity to do that again this year with Measure 80. By ending the failed war on marijuana and regulating the industry responsibly, pragmatically, and effectively, we can do that. So I urge you to vote yes on Measure 80 for Oregon's sake, for the safety of our youth, for the prosperity of our economy, for a model that will serve for the rest of the nation. Once again, Oregon can lead the way. We've been the pioneer state for 150 years, and we can continue to do that today.
That wraps up our forum for today. As our president-elect, John Horvick, returns to the stage, Let's give these gentlemen a big round of applause.
Can you give that, Paul? This is the amount.
I want to thank our True Squad members today, Ted Kay, Win Walka, and Jonathan Rodmacher. I'd also like to thank Tony Accarino, our timekeeper today, and a special thanks, of course, to our moderator, Stephan, and, of course, our great appreciation for our debaters, Paul Stanford and Joshua Marquis. Please join us again next week for Breaking the Silence, Online Women Driving the Change in the World's Most Challenging Places. We are adjourned.